So today I want to give you a description of the proposed amendments for the livestock regulatory amendment. It is meant for a quick update for all the main aspects, but it's not a complete description of every single requirement in the proposed amendment. So I think many of you have seen this slide before, so I'm just going to go over it really quick. It just really gives you the main objectives of the proposal. The main objectives are to include goats and farm cervids as regulated species, to also reduce the reporting window from 30 to 60 days to 7 days for all species. It's 7 days already for pigs. And it's to introduce the requirement for the identification of livestock premises through provincial premise ID programs and require that PID number as a reporting element. And then finally, it's to require movement reporting at destination premises, so move-in reporting, and also having a movement document accompany animals in transit that has that information that's needed at that destination premise. So now I'll jump right into the details. So premise identification, that's the first thing in the regulations that we want to talk about. So in the regulations, your premise identification number will be used in reporting, and it will be required to be reported when you purchase approved indicators and when you report information related to the movement of your cattle. And it will be required to keep your PID information up to date. The premise identification number is obtained through your provincial government program. Nothing is changing with that. So you get that number through your provincial government program, how you have always done, and there is no changing with that. And provinces may have different information they collect. They may have different ways they identify premises, but that would remain the provincial responsibility. The only thing you need for the regulations is that PID number. Animal identification. So as it is now, it's required to identify cattle and cattle carcasses with an approved indicator before they're removed from your farm or from your site. Unless they are moved to a recognized identification facility, formerly known as tagging sites. So the regulatory language will be recognized identification facility. You can still call them tagging sites. And tagging sites in the consultation period had been proposed to be restricted just to assembly points, but we have changed that and we've reverted back to allowing tagging sites at any site except for a terminal site. And that is exactly the same as the existing regulations, so the current regulations. There are other exceptions to the identification requirement when your cattle leave your farm. And so the other exceptions we've put in the regulations are you don't have to identify your animals if they're being seized based on welfare issue or they've been abandoned and they don't have an owner, obviously. You don't have to identify your animal if they're being urgently evacuated from premise. So if there's flooding going on and your animals aren't already identified, we don't care, evacuate your animals. You don't have to identify your animals if they have a morphology that does not allow for the application of an approved indicator. So that might be damaged ears, frostbitten ears. And you don't have to identify an animal if it's been urgently moved to a veterinary clinic. I would say that once your animal's been urgently moved somewhere, like from an evacuation or to a veterinary clinic, you will have to identify them down the road. You just don't have to identify them at that moment. You don't have to identify your animals when they're moved between premises of your farm. So if they're allowed to be moved within your farm without being identified. You don't have to identify an animal when it's born on a premise that is not a farm. You would identify it once it's moved back to your farm. So that's for the rare situations when a calf is born at an abattoir or assembly point or something like that, and then it's taken back to a farm and identified there. And then finally, you don't have to identify carcasses that leave the farm if they're carcasses of animals that died when they were less than 3 months of age. So right now, in the current regulations, you have to identify any carcass leaving your farm. So we've backed off of that and said that you don't have to identify them if they die at less than 3 months of age and they're leaving your farm. Okay, so that's identification. So now we'll move on to movement of cattle and carcasses. So this is the general rule. So I'm going to go over the general rule, which generally applies to farms and most sites, and then I'll go through the sites that have exceptions. So the general rule is it's required to report the information that's listed there when cattle and cattle carcasses arrive at your premise, and it has to be reported within 7 days. So you need to report the PID number of the departure premise, the PID number of your premise that it's arrived at, the date the animal left the departure premise, the date the animals arrived at your premise, the identification number on the approved indicators, and the license plate and the province, territory, or state issuing the license plate. So the ones that are underlined there would be provided to you by the transporter. So to be clear, it's a move-in report. So you're only reporting when the animals arrive at your premise. We have asked for the province, territory, or state, including the license plate, because we've realized that there's duplicative license plates in different provinces. So we wouldn't be able to establish whether it was a Saskatchewan license plate or Manitoba license plate unless we have that province. So that's the general rule. So that would apply to animals arriving on your farm, for example. There will be no movement reporting, like I said, for the departure of cattle or cattle carcasses from your premise. So no move out reporting, unless you're sending them to community pasture, a veterinary clinic, or an agriculture society site. And I'll discuss that on the next slides. There's no movement reporting when the movements are within the same farm. And there's no movement reporting when they're going to and back from a premise used for grazing purposes. It has to be grazing somewhere where there's no commingling with other animals from another site. So this would be leased pasture or rented pasture or some sort of pasture that you're using for grazing. You would not have to do movement reporting in that incidence. Okay, so now I'll talk about the exceptions. So movement of cattle to a community pasture. So the exception here is that we allow group movement reporting. So when animals go to a community pasture, we do not require the community pasture to do the reporting. So because of that, the onus is on the producer to do the reporting. So the producer does have to report that they've moved out to the community pasture within 7 days, and they have to report the PID of their premise, the PID of the community pasture, the date the animals left, the date they arrived, and the number of animals and species only, not the ID numbers, and the license plate. And then when the animals return from the community pasture, they have to report the move in, and again, they report the same information, and it's the species of each animal and the number of animals of each species. They do not have to report the ID numbers. And so this is what we call a group movement. I would comment that if you wanted to do so, you could report individual numbers, but it will not be required by the individual regulations. Movement of cattle to an agriculture society site. So that's what we mean by a site that has fairs and exhibitions and rodeos. The Canadian Association of Fairs and Exhibitions asked us to use that terminology. It's an easier terminology to describe all these different types of sites. But that's what we're talking about. Moving to fairs and exhibitions, cattle shows, and rodeos. So in this situation, we've changed from our initial proposal, and we are no longer putting the responsibility on the agriculture society site. We're putting the responsibility on the owner of the animals, so the producer. And so when animals go to a fair or show, they will you'll be required to report that they departed from your premise or moved out from your premise with the PID numbers of your premise and the Agricultural Society site, the date they left, the date they arrived, the identification number of each animal, and the license plate. And when they move back in from the fair, the exhibition, or cattle show, you will again have to report that move-in information, PID number of both sites, the date they left, the date they arrived, identification number, and the license plate. Now, having said that, the way we've written the regulation is that you're required to report both the move out to the fair and the move back in from the fair within 7 days after the event ended. So the idea is that the producer can do both reports at the same time. So you send your animals to the show or to the rodeo, you bring your animals back, and 7 days after the event's ended, that's when you have to report both that they've left and both that they've returned. So you can, it's really one reporting. It should just be one reporting for you, even though you're having to report both the move out and the move in. And the final thing I'll say about that is I do know that the big fairs and the big shows, sometimes there is software, I think it's called Expo, that is set up to talk to the responsible administrator databases. And when you register your animals with the fairs, they can actually do the reporting for you. So that's still allowed. So if the fair is offering to do that reporting for you, that's still okay. They can do that for you by proxy. That would be up to you. But at the end of the day, the regulation will say the responsibility is on the owner of the animals. Oh, and one more thing about that is that, and this is a big thing, we are doing the exact same thing with veterinary clinics. So veterinary clinics will be the same as fairs. It's on the onus is on the owner of the animals to report the move out and the move back. And you can do them at the same time. But it's on, the responsibility is on the owner of the animals. So assembly points. So assembly points are also what's considered group movement. So they are required to report within 7 days of arrival at an assembly point, the PID of the departure premise, the PID of the assembly point, the date the animals left the departure premise, the date the animals arrived at the assembly point, and the species and number of animals or carcasses of each species, and the license plate number. They will not have to report individual identification numbers. They only have to report, like I said, a group movement. So the number of animals and the species of animals. Now, we have provided one other option in the regulations for assembly points. And this is just an option. We've provided the option to use what is called a sighting system. So if the assembly point is equipped with an individual reading system where the animals are on arrival are run through a chute, and there's an automatic reader that uploads the information, and the information is able to be uploaded to the CCIA. If they wish to use that system, they do not have to report the information on the previous slide. They only have to report the identification number on the approved indicators, the date of the reading, and the PID of their assembly point. And we've narrowed what they have to report so that it can literally be done automatically. They could run through a chute, have it ding at the sighting system, and be directly uploaded to CCIA. And that way we get individual movement reporting, which is always preferable. And we think that future facing, this may actually be easier for assembly points once the technology is there. So we've given this as an option only. It's not required, but it's an option. So they can do one or the other, group movement reporting or individual reporting through a sighting system. Obviously, it only applies when cattle are arriving with indicators that are designed to be read with the reading equipment that the assembly site is using. So that the systems have to be able to work together, the tags and the reader. Oh, wrong way. Okay. Abattoirs. So for abattoirs are already required to report slaughter. This isn't new for them, but the information they have to report has changed. So they will be required to report when cattle or cattle carcasses arrive at the abattoir within 7 days of slaughter, death, or arrival. They have to report the PID of the departure premise, the PID of the abattoir, the date of the animal's death or slaughter, or the date of the arrival at the abattoir. It'll be up to the abattoir to choose which of those dates works best for them in their system, whether it's the date of slaughter or the date of arrival. Either one is acceptable. They have to report the identification number on the approved indicators as well. They also have to report the date the animals left the departure premise and the license plate. We have provided the option for abattoirs to report those two pieces of information, the date the animals left the departure premise and the license plate. They can either report it or they can keep it in record. And we've allowed this for abattoirs because information we received in the consultation is that this information is kept separately often in abattoirs in separate systems, and that they would prefer to have the option to report it or just keep it in record. So we've allowed that. I would note that cattle or cattle carcasses that arrive at the abattoir that are not identified, even though they should be, when they arrive and they're not identified, the abattoir is not required to put a new indicator on them. They still have to report that they were slaughtered, but they do not have to apply a new indicator. Export of cattle. So we already have to report export. It is already required in the current regulations, but again, it's changed slightly what you have to report and when. So when you export animals from your premise, it does have to be reported within 7 days. And what is required is the PID number of your premise, the country and address of the premise to which the animal was exported, the date the animals left your premise, the species and production type of each animal. And by production type, we mean dairy or beef. That's it. And the identification number on the approved indicators and the license plate number. Oh, wrong way again. Import of cattle. So again, import is already an event that is required under our regulations, but again, the information has changed and when you have to report. So first, it's required to identify cattle with an approved indicator as soon as they arrive at your premise, unless they are imported for immediate slaughter. Then they're not required. Now, we say it's required to identify cattle with an approved indicator as soon as they arrive at your premises, keeping in mind that if they already have an approved indicator on, you do not have to do this. And an indicator of a foreign country that's considered equivalent can be deemed an approved indicator by CFIA. So USDA 840 tags are deemed equivalent indicators by CFIA. So when they arrive on your premise, there's no need to apply another indicator. If they do arrive without an indicator, or they do arrive from some country where we don't consider the indicator equivalent, then you would have to apply an indicator. What is required to be reported when importing cattle or carcasses of imported cattle that have died en route? You're required to report within 7 days. And again, it's the country and address of the premises from which the animal or carcass was imported, the PID number of your premise, the date the animals or carcasses arrived at your premise, the species and production type of each animal or carcass, the identification number on the approved indicators, and the license plate number. Disposal of cattle carcasses. It is required to report the on-site disposal of cattle carcasses with approved indicators. It's required to report the following information: the PID of your premises, the date on which the carcass was disposed of, and the identification number on the approved indicator. And that should be done within 7 days of disposal. A big note that you are not required to report disposal of cattle carcasses that are being disposed of on their farm of origin that do not have an approved indicator applied yet. So if they die and they don't have an indicator on, there's no requirement. Loss of approved indicators. So it is required to apply an approved indicator to a cattle or cattle carcass that arrives at your premise without one. So you would have to apply. So if you have 30 cattle arrive and 1 or 2 of them arrive without an indicator, you must apply an indicator to them. And then you will be required to report their arrival, like you've done with all the other cattle that have arrived with an indicator, within 7 days, as well as the identification number of the new approved indicator that you have applied. If known, the identification number of the indicator that was previously applied and fallen off, and the date on which the new approved indicator was applied. The second example would be cattle have arrived at your premise, say 30 cattle have arrived at your premise with indicators on, and then a month later, you realize that, you know, a tag has fallen off an animal. So if a tag has fallen off an animal, you are required to apply an approved indicator to that animal once you've noticed it. And you'll be required to report that application within 7 days. And again, you report the identification number. If known, you report the identification number that was previously there, if you know it, the date on which you applied it, and again, the PID of your premise, and if you know it, the PID of the departure premise. And that we have that there because maybe in some cases, you know the animal that's lost its tag. You don't know the lost tag number, but you do know that that cattle came from, you know, Edwards Farm. And so you're able to report that at least to link the traceability. But that's only if known. So that comes to the end of the rules that I wanted to present today. The other thing I wanted to go over is the data that is collected. So the data that is collected, it's collected into the Canadian Cattle Identification Agency database, and it resides in that database. There's agreements between CCIA and CFIA for the privacy and the security of that data. And it is taken very seriously by both CCIA and both CFIA. When CFIA accesses that data, there are specific reasons we can access that data, and it's to administer and enforce our laws around animal health, animal diseases, and toxic substances that may affect animals, the protection of animals, human health and animal diseases that may be transmitted to humans, and food safety. And the same goes for provincial colleagues. So provincial colleagues also are able to access the data, but with the same guardrails, the same boundaries. And that's the only reason we would be accessing the data. So just to finish up, these regulations have been, 10 years in the making. We had a big consultation in 2023 and received, hundreds and hundreds of comments. And we've taken the time to analyze those comments, and we've gone back and re-engaged with the various stakeholders and groups and explored the areas in the regulatory proposal where changes can be made. And that's why you see some changes today. And that's where we are now with the proposed regulations. And so the stage we're in now is finalizing that regulatory text, and then going through governance with approvals within the federal government. We want to be prepared to communicate these changes to the livestock sector. We're preparing guidance to the regulated parties, both species-specific guidance and sector-specific guidance. So we'll have sort of one-pagers that tell you if you're a goat producer, what you need to do, if you're a cattle producer, and then one-pagers that tell you what you need to do if you are a feedlot versus a auction mart versus an abattoir versus a community pasture, and so on. The anticipated publication of the regulatory proposal is in winter 2026. By winter, I don't mean January. I'm sure it'll be at least March, so you know. And then that's just the publication of the proposal. Following that, there's a year before the published regulations come into force or come into effect. So that means they would not come into effect until 2027. And it's only in 2027 where stakeholders have to comply with the regulations. And the required compliance would be at that point. And again, still, I would, make sure you all understand that, compliance, when CFIA is looking at compliance, it's a continuum. When we have new regulations, we always start with educating, compliance promotion, making sure the regulated parties are aware, and then it escalates up from there. So it's a slow process of making sure there's understanding of the regulations, and then once there's understanding, starting to go forward with more serious enforcement measures. And that is all I have for you today.